Welcome to Hoodwinked with Dr. Mara Einstein, where we pull back the curtain on marketing scams, culty brands, and the tricksters trying to separate you from your money and your mental health. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to help bridge the balance between religions and cults, which we talked about over the last couple of episodes, and what that all has to do with marketing. So let's start talking about what are cults, or what people think about typically when they think about cults. And usually that is something like Heaven's Gate or Charles Manson, or they think about Jonestown, right? Where 909 people drank Flavor Aid laced with cyanide. And that's where we get the term drinking the Kool-Aid, that people did what somebody told them to do, not that they purposely committed suicide. The events of that were so awful, and that really laid the groundwork for how people think of cults as fundamentally something that's wrong. But that's not the only way that we think about cults anymore. We think about cults as things like Apple, or we think about them as Harley Davidson, or we think about them as it relates to the leaders connected to them. So people might think about Steve Jobs and Apple, right? He would be considered a cult leader for a lot of people. We might also think of Sam Bankman-Fried or Elizabeth Holmes or Elon Musk. So for those of you who may not know, Sam Bankman-Fried was the founder of FTX, and he bilked people out of approximately $10 billion. Elizabeth Holmes found Theranos, and she suggested that with just a single drop of blood, she had a piece of an equipment that would enable people to be able to find out if there were any problems with someone based on that single drop of blood. It couldn't. And the other one is Elon Musk. Two of these people are in jail, and the other one should be. But why? Why do we think of cults as something beyond religion? And why is that happening now? And there's really specific reasons for that. And before I dig into that a lot, I want to talk a little bit about how I got to thinking about this, and specifically how it led me to write my book, Hoodwinked. And how I came to that was, we were in the middle of the pandemic. I was locked down, like a lot of people were, and I live in Queens. And Queens was the epicenter of the pandemic, because that's where JFK Airport is. So people coming in internationally were coming here. So we were locked down. And so I would go down into the basement, and I would get onto my elliptical, and I would watch documentaries. And I was watching The Vow, which was about the NXIVM cult. And I was watching LuLaRich, which was the docuseries about LuLaRoe. LuLaRoe is a multi-level marketing company that is in a legal pyramid scheme. And I was watching these two things side by side, and I was going, holy smokes, they're the same thing. They are the same thing. It just kind of blew my mind. Well, as I began to study multi-level marketing, I came to find out I wasn't the first person who figured this out. Plenty of other people had. But what I did do is I began to pull back and think, okay, I've been looking at brand cults for about 10 years. And how could I think about this more broadly as it relates to multi-level marketing and then brand cults? So that's how I decided to look at all this. And I've been looking at religion, the intersection of religion and marketing, for close to 30 years. But something different happened with the introduction of digital, and that's what pushed it into the area of cults. But let's look specifically at what is the definition for cult. And we talked about this a little bit with Katie Lofton, and we talked a little bit about this with Sarah Edmondson. But I want to put it a little bit more into an academic thinking, and a little bit shorter so you can get from one place to the other about how we think about cults now. When we think about cults from the 17th century, it was simply a religious sect or group that venerates a figure, a deity, or an object. And so if you've traveled around the world and you've gone to, say, Italy and gone to a museum, you might have seen somebody who was a saint, and they would talk about the cult of Saint whoever. Right? It wasn't anything pejorative about it. It was simply a group of people really liked this particular saint. And what happened by the 19th century is that it expanded to include non-religious figures. Now, all of that changed in the late 20th century, and there were a couple of specific reasons why. There were an increase in alternative religions in the United States, and a lot of what created the space for that to happen is the Immigration Act of 1965. That allowed more Asians to enter the United States. And they came with religions that Americans weren't used to. Not that they were strange religions. They were religions that were unknown to people in the United States. And so Buddhism and Hinduism and meditation and all of these kinds of things were things that Americans didn't know. The word cult became a way to say religions that we don't like, that we don't know, that we don't understand, that we want to push aside. Also remember, this was a time when the Beatles were hanging out with the Maharishi. So that was another area where people were seeing religions they weren't used to. So add into this, by the late 1960s, the media began to pick up on this idea of a cult, particularly as it relates to things like Charles Manson and Jonestown, and then Waco, and then Heaven's Gate. And so we began to think of cults as a group of people who were manipulated to ultimately a very bad end. But what happens in the year 2000 is you have this introduction of brand cults. And so it begins to change our idea of what that word is. And so now cults are simply a group of people who coalesce around an idea. It's a much more expanded idea of this. Now, this is not to say that there aren't still some cults that are dangerous, because there definitely are, but there are some that aren't. And we see this expanded idea of cults in our society when you think about things like the book called The Cult of Trump, or cultish, or uncultured. But we've also seen documentaries like the documentary about WeWorks. And we know Adam Newman was very much a cult leader. We also know that he was very involved in the Kabbalah Center, which has at least cult-like leanings, let us say. And we have documentaries like Apple Cider Vinegar, where we have influencers like Belle Gibson who lead people down a path that is not healthy for them, right? She told people that she had brain cancer and then told people what kind of diet they should practice in order to be able to get rid of their cancer. Well, she never had cancer, but people followed her because they believed that she did. So that's cults, right? So we have this new idea of cults. It's more expanded. It's not just a dangerous group of people. It can also be other kinds of communities. It can be other groups. And now let's look at the changing importance of brands in our lives. And so some of you who are marketers will say, I know brands. Or you yourself, you have brands that you like, you have brands that you don't like. But let's deconstruct specifically what a brand is. Brands are meaning-making through commodities. Think about when you buy a product. It's no longer transactional. It isn't just, I need a phone, and I'm going to buy a phone. It's, I need an iPhone. And that iPhone says all kinds of things about you. I remember when my daughter was younger and she had a Samsung phone, and her friends at school said, "Are you poor?" Which is crazy, right? Because the Samsung phone wasn't any less expensive than an iPhone. But the iPhone said to everybody else, I'm tech savvy. I'm rich, right? Because you also have the earpods and all of that sort of thing. So again, brands are meaning making through commodities. And so what you have as part of a brand, you have an icon or a symbol, you have a tagline if they have it, and you have a mythology. You have a story. There's always a story behind the brand. And the reason for the story is that when you see that icon, like you see the Nike swoosh, the expectation is that you will think of everything that you know about Nike, so that you may think the best of athleticism, or you think of Michael Jordan. You think of all of those ads. You think different. And that's the expectation, that when you see that story, that meaning making will happen for you when you engage with that logo. The other key thing to understand is that marketers know that consumers do not connect with things. They connect with ideas or stories. And that's why the mythology behind the brand is so important. So if we want to think about this, and it's a little more difficult for me to do this on a podcast, but I will try. When I present this information, I show an ad from the 1950s from Marlboro. And it shows a man, and then it's obviously from the 1950s, it's going to be black and white. And it's a guy working on his car.
This is a man who smokes Marlboro cigarettes. What kind of a man is he? I'm a guy who likes to work on my car. I like to take it apart and put it back together. I get to working on it and forget where I am, what time it is. I even forget to eat.
You don't forget to smoke, though.
I always smoke when I work. They go together.
Why Marlboro?
Well, it's a combination of things. When I draw on a cigarette, I want to taste something. With Marlboro, I do. Yet it's got a filter that works. Then there's this flip-top box. I like things that are well designed.
I get working on my car and I get so busy I forget to eat, but I don't forget to smoke. Now, we would never in a million years do an ad like that. Marketers today would never, ever, ever, ever do that. And if I said to you, Marlboro, what would be the first thing that would come to your mind? It would probably be the cowboy, right? Because the Marlboro Cowboy was something that was created by Leo Burnett, which is an agency that was well known for creating characters related to a product so people could have the image of the character in their mind, right? This idea of meaning making through commodities. So that people don't think about Marlboro and think, oh, I'm going to smoke my cigarette and have the flavor and have this wonderful flip-top box. What they think about is a cowboy on the range and how manly that is, right? And what's so fascinating about Marlboro from this perspective, and it's really important to think about in terms of branding, is that brands could be anything, right? They decided to make Marlboro a manly cigarette. But in fact, when Marlboro first came out, it was a female cigarette. And the brown wrapper around the edge of the filter was there to hide lipstick stains. The decision to make a brand one thing or another or target one group of people or another is fundamentally based in how the marketing works. And so the importance of this has to do with we use brands as part of our identity creation. We have a Mac or we have a PC. We are Nike or we're Under Armour. We're Tesla. Right? I always think about Tesla because it's such a great example now. Several months ago, people were taking the Tesla logo off their cars because they didn't want people to connect them to that brand. So that's a perfect example of how we align ourselves with the products that we use. Another thing that happens is the use of the language I am in advertising. I am Mac. I am PC. I am FedEx. I am Vera Bradley. Look and see where you see that and think about it for just a second. It's not I use Mac or I use Vera Bradley. It's I am that. It is associating you and your identity with that product. But it's not enough that the brands are doing that. Brands are embedded with values that attract people based on their beliefs and their affinities. And we see that in so many brands now. And a lot of people talk about this in terms of purpose marketing, right? But it's not just that. So something like Fenty, for example, that has this idea of being all-inclusive. And so people buy the brand because of that. It's also, if you look at all their foundations, they have a foundation color for just about any person on the planet. You think of something like Patagonia, and it tells people not to go shopping. Patagonia is well thought of as a brand connected to sustainability. Or you think of something like Tom's, which has the idea of buy one, give one. The other example that I love to give as it relates to this is Lush Cosmetics. A while back, Frances Haugen was the Facebook whistleblower, and she talked about how being on Instagram was so dangerous, particularly for teen girls and their own self-image, particularly as it related to eating disorders and how they should look and what their body should be like.
And what's super tragic is Facebook's own research says, as these young women begin to consume this eating disorder content, they get more and more depressed, and it actually makes them use the app more. And so they end up in this feedback cycle where they hate their bodies more and more. Facebook's own research says it is not just that Instagram is dangerous for teenagers, that it harms teenagers. It's that it is distinctly worse than other forms of social media.
And so Lush Cosmetics immediately put something onto their page that just said, be somewhere else. Be somewhere else. Because they knew that that's who their target audience was. And they didn't want to perpetuate the idea that those young girls should be on their site. Now, that was 3 or 4 years ago that happened. And if you go on their website today, they still have something on there and it says, "What the Zuck." And it has all kinds of information about how bad being on Instagram is for young people. So they stuck with what they believed in. They didn't walk away just because nobody was paying attention anymore, right? They stuck with the beliefs of what was important, particularly to their consumer. Somebody that I want to introduce you to, in a book I'd like to introduce you to, it's called The Wrong Way Home. And it's by a psychiatrist and a psychiatry professor named Arthur Dykman. And he wrote this book in the 1990s, shortly after Waco. He talks about a number of things in this book that have stuck with me, and I highly recommend the book. He writes about cults, but there's a really wonderful quote from the book, and it's this: "Advertisers and the corporate world have been very influential in defining us to ourselves. Such covert indoctrination is typical of cults. In this instance, it is not a particular religion or philosophy being served, but rather the enhancement of desire, the selling of products, the protection of the status quo." Mind blown on that one. But why? Why is it that corporations and brands have been able to fill a void for us in terms of our identity creation? It's because traditional institutions have declined in their authority. And so the market came in to fill that void. And so when I talk about cultural institutions, what I mean is church or synagogue or mosque. People don't attend traditional religious services the way that they used to, or it doesn't have the same impact on us, certainly in terms of our identity, as it did, say, 40 or 50 years ago. People don't work for the same company for 30 years. People can't imagine that. People used to work for IBM for 30 years. I know people at MTV now that were there when I was there 30 years ago. That is rare. The current statistic is that people, by the time they're 49, will have 11 jobs. So there isn't that identity connected to what we do for a living necessarily. And also our family names just don't have that same kind of impact that they might have before. And so brands came in to fill that space. Now, how did it get to be cults? Well, it didn't start out being cults in the digital space. It started out being what were known as brand communities. And this was something that was talked about in the academic literature starting in the early 2000s. And there was a lot of writing, particularly by these two scholars named Muñez and Oguen. And they wrote about brand communities as a specialized, non-geographically bound community, i.e., a digital community, based on a structured set of social relations among admirers of a brand. And so it was people coalescing around a brand, getting together and focusing on a brand, as opposed to focusing on, say, God or worshiping some other idol, right? And brand communities were created by the brands themselves, but they weren't always. Sometimes they were created by people who just really liked a particular product. But brand communities, whether they were created by the brand or by people who were fans of the brand, tapped into the fundamental desire to be part of a community, no matter what it's attached to. And that's really key to remember in terms of cults. They're tapping into us wanting to be in community with one another. There were a lot of articles written about Jeep and Jeep Jamboree because that was a way to create community around that vehicle. Because the key point to Jeep isn't about, looking like you're driving an army vehicle. It's about being able to drive off-road, and people didn't learn how to do that. And so the company said, well, let's get a bunch of people together and teach them how to do that. When you went, you didn't go by yourself. You brought your family member or a friend. And so you connected with other people over the course of a weekend. Nike Run Club, right? People get onto that app and they compare with each other their running styles. One of my favorite is World Nutella Day. That wasn't created by the brand. That was created by people who love Nutella. And they created a website. And what's really funny is they created the website and the company kept telling them to take it down because they weren't happy about the fact they hadn't created it themselves, which is crazy. We would never imagine anyone would do that now. And finally, the brand got wise and said, okay, we'll let you do this. But what happened by 2005 is there were a couple of books that came out. One was called The Power of Cult Branding, and the other was called The Culting of Brands. And so we had moved from brand communities in the early 2000s. So by 2005, we were talking about brand cults. And one of the things that they talked about in the culting of brands was this: the same dynamics are at play behind the attraction of brands and cults. When research subjects recounted their reasons for joining and committing, they described the profound urges to belong, to make meaning, feel secure, have order within chaos, and create identity. So people were getting the same thing out of brands that they were getting out of religious groups or cults. And so today we're seeing this in brands like Lululemon or Trader Joe's or Dollar Shave Club. In 2005, there were a limited number of brand cults, but today the number of them have expanded greatly. And the reason for this is that being a brand cult has become the North Star for marketers. And the reason for that is actually quite simple. No one wants to interact with advertising. We do everything we can not to see an ad. We have remote controls, so we skip ads. We have ad blockers on our computers. We don't want advertising to interrupt our entertainment experience, and we will do anything not to have that happen. When we became really savvy at avoiding marketing, advertisers said, okay, we have to find a way to get you to engage with advertising so you don't know that you're engaging with advertising. And so advertising became more and more and more covert. First with things like native ads, which are ads that appear in your social media feeds that look like something your friend would send you, but is actually advertising from a brand, or branded content, right? Something that looks like a video that's just another piece of content. It could be a YouTube video. And you find out at the end that you actually have been watching something that's been paid for by a marketer. Or you have product placement, or you have the Lego movie, right? All of these things are ways for you to spend time with branded content, or what's known as SponCon, that you don't know that you're engaging with that kind of content. And if we're looking at that in terms of social media, obviously we're talking about that as it relates to influencers as well. And the reason why marketers became so surreptitious in terms of their advertising and marketing is that they had to be sure that brands were so important to us that if we never saw an ad again, they would be part of our identity and therefore something that we would automatically buy. So here's the paradox. Cult brands wouldn't exist if we were willing to give our time and attention to marketers. Think about that for a second. If we just watched the damn ads to begin with, we wouldn't be dealing with brand cults now. When your connection to the brand is something that's beyond a simple transaction, it becomes less mindful. You don't know that you've been engaging with an ad, so you're more likely to think, oh, okay, this is really kind of cool. Okay, I'll buy it. Or an influencer comes on your screen and you think, oh, I trust this person. They're not going to sell me something that's bad for me. And so you buy into things far more quickly. The other thing that happens is today people are feeling anxious and vulnerable for a lot of reasons. Some of it has to do with the technology, but some of it has to do with the world we're living in right now. Being that vulnerable leaves us open to cult tactics. We want to believe that someone has the answers to all of life's problems. And that's especially true as we become more insecure, as we feel more insecure. Some people would also argue that marketers are specifically looking to infantilize us and using infantilization tactics. Now you can think about it in terms of things like Labubu. It's kind of a childish thing. And so if we go back to Arthur Dykman, one of the other things he writes about is about us wanting to be in the backseat of the car and let our parents drive. Let them take us so that we can fall asleep and not have to take responsibility for what's going on, that we don't have to be in control. And then remember, he wrote that in the 1990s. So that's not new. This idea of maybe not wanting to take responsibility, but it is certainly far more pervasive than it was before. And all of that leaves us more vulnerable. Okay, so let's really dig in. How do marketers use cult tactics? This is based on the work of Lauren Dawson and his book, Comprehending Cults. And so there's 9 steps here that I'm going to talk about. And then I'm going to talk about some additional things that other scholars have added to this mix. So the first step in this process is to identify prospective recruits. And the best prospective recruits is to target vulnerable people. That's why I spent all that time talking about being vulnerable just a second ago. The example that I like to give about where to find people who are vulnerable is freshmen on college campuses. Group of people who haven't made friends yet, trying to find a way to fit in, or people who have moved to a new community. Somebody comes along and says, "Oh, I have this great group." And you say, "Hi, sure, I'll go." The next step in the process is to lure recruits with deception. So this is part of the reason why I got really interested in this. My whole reason for being, in terms of the work that I do, is to help people see deceptive marketing tactics. Initial interactions with these groups are going to be something that's very benign. So it's going to be something like, come take a free meditation class, or come have a free dinner. And then the next thing you know, you've been recruited by the Hare Krishnas, who now call themselves IXCON. Then the next step in the process is to upsell. Once you've gotten people into the group, you've taken one class. Oh, take another class. Oh, pay for this weekend away. Then it's love bombing, telling people how wonderful they are, how smart they are. We see this a lot in multi-level marketing. They tell all of the people who they've brought on as part of their downline, yes, we know you're going to be fabulous at this. Then tough love starts to kick in. And that's when you've been upsold, right? So you've started committing more. You've been love bombed, so you feel like you're part of the group and the people really like you. And then they say, you've got to commit yourself more. You've got to take a 6-month class. And then you're going to say something like, I can't afford to pay for that. And they're going to come back and say, if you really cared, you'd find the money. If you have to max out your credit card, you'll max out your credit card, right? Those are the kinds of tactics that they use. And then there's sensory deprivation, not allowing you to sleep, limiting the amount of food you have. By and large, marketers don't use that. We could look at an example like CrossFit that expects you to work out until you puke, frankly, and tells you exactly what to eat. So there are situations where those do happen in consumer cults, though not typically. The next step is to renounce those who question the group. Separate you from anyone who would tell you that there's a problem with you being part of that cult. Then they introduce the core beliefs, because by that time, you've spent a lot of money, you've been indoctrinated into the group, you've been separated from people who would tell you that there's a problem with the group, and so you're fully immersed. And that's when they can tell you who they really are. And then the last part of the process is having severe repercussions when you want to leave. So you can think about this in terms of a lot of these groups are incredibly litigious, right? If you leave and you talk about us, we're going to sue you. Groups have been known to follow people and record them. So it becomes very uncomfortable to leave. Now, anyone who's a marketer who's been listening to this up till now, and you've listened to the list of what I've talked about in terms of recruitment and retention, should have figured out that this sounds exactly like the marketing funnel. Exactly like the marketing funnel. Because what happens in the marketing funnel is you have the top of the funnel, which is awareness, where you're trying to get as many people as possible to know about you. And then from there, you go to consideration. Once you know about my product, I'm going to hit you up with everything I can to get you to want to stay. I'm going to upsell you. I'm going to love bomb you. I am going to tell you all the wonderful things I'm going to do for you if you buy my product. The next step in the process, people will think of it as purchasing, but in the marketing funnel, it's known as conversion, which I think is hysterical, right? It's flat out the same thing as religion. It is conversion. So once you've bought the product, you have converted to that brand. And the last step of the process is loyalty. And in today's parlance, loyalty is marketing evangelism. So that what you have is a situation where marketers are using the exact same tactics as cults do, in order to get people to engage with the products. So let's look at this really specifically. And the first thing we're going to look at is targeting the vulnerable through the messaging. And this is an example of something that is used on social media.
Steal this ad to increase sales on Facebook ads. This is called a before and after ad. And before you say before and after ads aren't allowed, they actually are. They're only not allowed for weight loss and cosmetic procedure ads. Plus, there's a ton of ways to use this type of ad strategy without saying before and after.
So that in and of itself is not new, right? There's no ad that's going to tell you that you're great just the way you are. Because if I tell you that you're perfect, you're not going to go out and buy my product. So this idea of telling you that there's something wrong with you, that's kind of fundamental to marketing. It gets to be a lot if you're online and you see these kinds of ads over and over and over again. Another way that marketers target the vulnerable is through the branding. And the example I give for this is Brandy Melville. Some of you may have seen the documentary Brandy Hellville on HBO. That brand is specifically targeted to young girls, specifically adolescent girls. That in and of itself is a very vulnerable group, but it is a brand that has one size, and the size is incredibly small. I suggest you go look at their website. It is, to my mind, horrifying how thin the girls are on that site. But they're being pushed to do that because they think that this is what they are supposed to look like. I won't talk about it here, but if you want to learn more about the things that go on with this brand, I do recommend the documentary. The other way that marketers use cult tactics is by luring with deception. And this gets into the stealth marketing that I was talking about before. A couple of ways that this happens, particularly in social media spaces. It's very difficult oftentimes to know whether or not you are engaging with an ad or if you're engaging with legitimate content, because the markings that say hashtag ad or sponsored are very hidden. Another place where you see this is branded journalism. And so if you're looking at something from, say, the New York Times, they do a lot of videos and they look like they are legitimate documentaries. They'll do a talking head of a professor speaking, and they'll have the name of the professor and say that it's a professor of XYZ. There was a professor of anatomy talking about feet, and it turns out it was actually an ad in the New York Times for Birkenstocks. But you'd be hard-pressed to find that, because you would be looking at it saying, oh, this professor is telling me what I should be doing that's going to be beneficial for my feet. That has become more and more common. Okay, let's talk about some other things to look for in terms of cults. One is a charismatic, often narcissistic leader. Now, you don't always have to have a leader, but it is very common for that to happen. And the reason why I say you don't have to have one, particularly in consumer spaces, if you have ever been on a diet or been on an exercise regimen, you know how many calories you need to eat. You know what you can and can't eat. You know how many points you're supposed to count, how many hours you're supposed to work out. You have an internalized cult leader. You don't need somebody outside telling you what to do. And what's interesting now in terms of GLP-1s is people talk about the food noise. And I think that that's getting rid of your internal cult leader. The food noise and the GLP-1s is shutting up the cult leader, which I think is a fascinating thing to think about. The other thing to look for is a transcendent belief system that provides answers to all of life's questions. And I'm depending on the work of Janja Lalich, who is a sociologist and cult expert when I talk about this. Somebody who says to you that they have the answers to all of life's questions, no matter what, that should lead you to run for the door. A good example of that might be MAGA, because MAGA in and of itself doesn't mean anything. It means whatever the people who connect themselves to it thinks that it means. But in and of itself, it doesn't have a lot of meaning, but it can provide a whole worldview for the people who believe in it. Let's give a couple of examples of charismatic cult leaders in the commercial space. One example is Brittany Dawn, and some of you may know Brittany Dawn. She is someone who said to her followers that she was going to provide personalized diet and fitness plans. And what happened is her followers got together on a private Facebook group and discovered that none of it was personalized. All of them were getting the same information from her. So she was sued by the state of Texas to the tune of $400,000. And so she pivoted and became a Christian influencer. Now, that's a common practice because what happens with Christian influencers is they can say, oh, forgiveness is part of the program. If you don't forgive her, then there's something wrong with you, right? So it becomes a pivot against the audience. It's interesting to me because now all of a sudden people keep asking me about this guy, Vishen Lakhiani. Vishen Lakhiani is the founder of Mind Valley. Mind Valley is a site online that has classes in terms of work and spirituality and coaching and all kinds of things. What's interesting about Mind Valley is that there are some legitimate teachers on the site. I will give you that. But there's a lot of junk on the site. There's a lot of information on the site that's trying to get you to be a coach. And one of the videos they have about that is there aren't too many coaches. Now, if they have to make a video about there aren't too many coaches to make you feel okay about it, there are probably too many coaches. But the key thing to know about Mind Valley is go try and find any derogatory information about the company. It is almost impossible to find. And I looked, I promise, I looked. You might go to YouTube and find a couple of videos that say, this is an honest review of Mind Valley. And it'll start out saying it's an honest review and people have said this and this, and then it pivots. Oh, but really, you know what? I stuck with it and this class changed my life. So they all spin and they ultimately all end up being positive reviews. And then go look in the show notes. And all of the show notes will have an affiliate link for you to get a discount on one of the classes at Mind Valley. I could talk more about Vishen Lakhiani. You can go to my website and find a post about him. He's not somebody you want to spend a lot of time dealing with. Another one is Jessie Lee Ward. Some of you may be familiar with Jessie Lee Ward. She was a person who was very high up in a multi-level marketing company. She decided to take some of her lead salespeople on a trip, I believe it was to Colombia, and they thought they were going on a luxurious tour. And it turns out she took them on a 15-hour walk by the equator. They had to sleep on the beach. Some of them got sick. It was a terrible thing, and a number of people called her out on it on social media. The last person is Andrew Tate. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time with him either. The only thing I will say about Andrew Tate is that he has created a university, and I put university in quotes. And basically what the university does is bilk men out of $49 a month to take classes that he says are with him, that are not with him, that will enable them to make as much money as he does or has. The guy went to jail. He should still be in jail. He's not in jail anymore. But if you are taking classes with him, you are being hoodwinked. So the last aspect of cults that I want to talk about is this idea of the creation of in and out groups. And in social media, what we have is the creation of in and out groups by algorithms. And traditionally, what we would have thought about is that if you had to have a cult, you had to have them on a compound. They had to be down in Waco, or they had to be in Oregon with Rajneesh on a compound there. But it wasn't the kind of thing where people could be living their lives day to day amongst other people. But now, because of algorithms and the way that they work, we have been siloed into the groups of people who agree with us. And if anybody who we don't agree with comes into that space, we jump on them and tell them no, right? So we've created this situation where anybody who disagrees with the cult that we belong to, we push them away. All of this happens for marketing purposes. Don't ever forget that the algorithms are separating us into our behaviors so that marketing can be used to sell us more products. We are increasingly pushed to more and more extreme content. And we know this because on YouTube, 70% of the viewing is based on AI-driven recommendations. 70%. So 70% of what you're watching isn't stuff that you selected. It's what AI has said that you want to watch. As we look at the most extreme forms of cults and cult marketing and commercial cults, what we get to is multi-level marketing. And multi-level marketing is quite simply legalized pyramid schemes. So in this case, we're talking about things like Amway or doTERRA or Herbalife or Young Living. And so for my book, I created something called the cult marketing continuum. And what happens in the cult marketing continuum is it starts with brand cults on the left. It moves then to influencers, who I call cult light. From cult light influencers to social media extremism, because you have influencers who begin to get into things like conspirituality, right? So you had a lot of new age influencers, particularly during COVID, who began to say things like, do your own research, and began to be anti-vaxxers. And that then goes to multi-level marketing, which are cults. And when I interviewed multi-level marketing people and cult experts and asked them to do a Venn diagram of MLMs and cults, they said it would be a circle, one and the same thing. As you move through this continuum, you have an increased level of extremism and you have an increased level of anxiety. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that it's not that we're living in an attention economy. It's that we're living in an anxiety economy, because it's not just enough for us to be looking at our phone. It's that we have to be so ginned up. We have to be so anxious, and that anxiety makes us vulnerable, right? So we're opened up to the marketing messages, and we need to find ways to release that. And the way that we release it is either through doom scrolling, spending more time on social media, or by buying something. And that's the goal. And while all of this is definitely still an issue, there is room for hope, because there's some things that are changing. One of the things is enshittification. And enshittification is Cory Doctorow's idea that there is a pattern of what happens in social media spaces, which is the creators come, they build a wonderful platform, and they're encouraged to come with incentives by the social media platform. They create, the followers come on board, and everybody has this wonderful space where they want to engage and create community. And then what happens? The advertisers come, and all of a sudden the space falls apart. And certainly anybody who's been on TikTok, certainly recently, has felt that. It's not the same space it used to be. The minute you open it up, there's an ad. Every third post is an ad. It's just not the space that it used to be. And what we're starting to feel too is this idea of posting zero. On a space like TikTok, it used to be that you could be a little grungy, you could be a little dirty. And it isn't that way anymore. It's become much more professionalized. And the expectation of the quality of the video is supposed to be higher. And people are feeling like, you know what? I can't compete. I can't do that. So people may spend time engaging or looking, but they're not posting. And that's part of the reason why you're not seeing some of your favorite people there anymore. Now, the other good news, so people are looking for other ways to engage. People are looking for other ways to find community. And one of the things that Arthur Dykman, again, I told you I love that book, talks about that we need to see each other face to face. One, we need to start understanding each other and being in each other's shoes. We may not agree with each other, but let's not avoid each other. This idea of meeting each other face to face and what you can and can't say to a loved one or someone who's a friend, telling someone that they're wrong, or telling someone that they're doing something dangerous, or telling someone that you aren't happy with something that they did, is not being a friend. That is coming from a loving place. And I think we've spent so much time, particularly during COVID, away from each other, that we need to start practicing that. And we need to find a little more grace for each other. The good news about cults is that most people get out of cults. So we have that to hold up. The other thing is the anti-MLM movement can provide us a roadmap for how to get away from cults. And one of the things that they do, and we will get into this in a later episode, is they start by talking about MLM content. So someone might be scrolling in YouTube and looking for MLM content, and they come across somebody who's actually an anti-MLMer. They see what they think is MLM content, and then in the middle of the content, it pivots to anti-MLM content. And what happens is that starts to create cognitive dissonance for members of the cult, and they realize that it's time for them to leave after they've heard this over and over and over again. Let me wrap this up with just a couple of thoughts. When I interviewed marketers for my book, Hoodwinked, I didn't tell them what the subtitle was. And the subtitle is How Marketers Use the Same Tactics as Cults. And I got two responses. One was, yeah, that's what we do. And the other was, yeah, that's what we do. So they are aware of how they are using these tactics to get you to buy things you may want, but it also may be things you don't need and maybe can't afford. So this is why I want you to know what they do. And that's why I say we take the hood off. It's time to be aware of the patterns and to take back your agency. And I'm here to help you do that. Subscribe to Hoodwinked with Dr. Mara Einstein on your favorite podcast app for new episodes every other Tuesday. You can follow me at Dr. Mara Einstein on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Threads. You can pick up a copy of my book, Hoodwinked, How Marketers Use the Same Tactics as Cults, and please do, wherever you buy your books. Hoodwinked is produced by Multitude. Our lead producer and editor is Bren Frederick. Thanks to Kayla Einstein for our cover art and Mark Langer for our theme music.